thank you all for having me. It's a real honor, and I've already learned a whole lot this weekend. And probably if I could freeze time, I could see a number of different ways I could go in the talk I'm going to go today. But I'm going to stick with the script. We run a tight ship here. In Mahayana Buddhism, the business of handing over spiritual wisdom. Can you hear me? All right. The Dharma.
Louder, if you would.
What's that? Louder.
And we can move up too if we need to.
The business of handing over spiritual wisdom, the Dhamma, which leads to enlightenment, from one person to another, requires that communication is transmitted in an idiosyncratic fashion, absolutely particular to the individual receiving it. The Sanskrit word for this tailoring of the message is upaya, or skillful or expedient means. English doesn't have a word that adequately translates the notion of upaya. But a parable from the foundational Buddhist text, the Lotus Sutra, helps to illustrate the idea. The Buddha came upon a gardener. Seeking to convey to him the good news of enlightenment, he handed the gardener a flower. That is, he didn't resort to dogmatic teachings or esoteric language, or for that matter to language itself, use of which would have rendered the Buddha's communication to the gardener strange and foreign, like someone giving you directions in a foreign tongue. The Buddha chose rather to communicate the understanding of enlightenment through the medium the gardener knew best, the language of flowers. Other parables further refine the notion of upaya, such as one in which a man, seeing his house engulfed in flames, falsely tells his sons inside the house, who are young and cannot comprehend the danger threatening them, that desirable toys, in fact the toy most dear to each boy's heart, lies just outside the house, thus enticing them with this false premise from the house in order to save them from the fire, though he conscientiously indeed later endows them with the toys. In yet another, a leader paints a vision for his followers of a city that has not yet been built in order to get them there to build it. For these early Buddhists, anything human, even in extremity, even violence or sexuality or theft, all could become upayas. What is critical is that the messenger render his or her message in a way that the recipient experiences as their own. In each of these cases, upaya means speaking in the language of the other, intuiting what is meaningful to him or her and motivating, and presenting the message in those terms. The point of all these parables that is so hard to put into English is this, that every person sees, feels, and experiences the word differently through his or her own lens, determined by his or her own cultural, historical, family, and individual experience. And to best communicate with one another, we work best by speaking in, or at least being cognizant of, their personal language. Connections between Buddhism and the healing arts have long been noted. Of the relationship between psychoanalysis and Buddhism in particular, the noted British analyst Nina Coulthard has said, "There's never been, from the earliest days, any sense of conflict about combining these practices. There are more extensive and subtle ways in which they flow in and out of each other and are mutually reinforcing and clarifying." Most importantly for our work here today, healing, like enlightenment, cannot be done alone, nor in alienation from the spirit or soul or essence of the ill person. Throughout history, and today as never before, both the experience of illness and the experience of treating affliction takes place within relationship, and often within a complex series of relationships. In their reliance on witch doctors, oracles, shaman, priests, as well as in the family-wide and community-wide experiences of illness, our forebears well understood this, and the severance of the simultaneous connections of spiritual and social bonds to the body in pain and illness is a recent development, another artifact of the modern situation of the body within the biomedical model. My own discipline, psychoanalysis, focuses on these most basic tasks of healing, the relationship and putting the patient's suffering into words. In psychoanalytic therapy, formulating the problem in the patient's own language is the critical task of the work. This means putting the patient's experience into words that feel, that bring the patient's inner world to life in shared awareness, and so render digestible, because communicable and mutual, the pain that drives the patient's suffering. One of the ways this happens is through what is called the neutrality or free-floating attention of analytic listening. With analytic listening, the analyst attempts to hear the music of the patient's message through the words. That is, what a patient seems to be saying may often conceal more fundamental themes or preoccupations, which become visible only by noting the recurrences, idiosyncrasies, and ellipses in what a patient has to say. This may sound esoteric, but it is indeed something we all do all the time, sometimes intuitively. Most of us in daily conversation become aware of the idiosyncrasies of our interlocutor's speech. When a person speaks quickly or slowly, or with frequent interruptions or silences, when a person loses their train of thought, or is easily distracted, or repeats him or herself. In analytic listening, everything becomes significant. When a person breaks off a thought, for example, the attention of the analyst is naturally drawn to the point of the break and what might have led to it. Or an insistence on a particular detail or particular kind of insult or preoccupation, each point further in the direction of the patient's inner life. A repetition of a certain interest or theme may merit further inquiry, as might the intensity or lack thereof with which a person expresses him or herself upon a certain point. Such attention to the language between analyst and patient encourages a singular connection, because the patient feels paid attention to in a way that is usually only found in the most intimate of relationships. That this intimacy occurs with someone who is in most ways a stranger is precisely the condition that makes psychic change possible in psychotherapy. Speaking in the patient's language requires that one be cognizant of all these dimensions of the caregiving relationship, and others besides. It requires stepping outside oneself to imagine how you are being experienced by the patient, and how they experience their illness and treatment. Above all, entering the patient's world, mainly but not only through their words, is critical to forging the relationship through which healing takes place. This happens along the lines of the original relationship between mother and infant. For the mother must learn the ways of her baby, to learn the particular cries and motions that variously signal hunger, colic, fatigue, a need to be held, a need to be free, etc. This act of translation is at the root of how a child finds itself in the world through its mother. When I say mother, of course, I mean the primary caregiver, whoever is in charge with this initial act of translation. It begins, of course, by listening and being open to the otherness of the other. We must resist the impulse to fill the gaps in the patient's story with our own assumptions. And we must hear them, listening not just for the words, but for the music in what they have to tell us. This emphasis on listening and communication has its roots in medicine itself. Medicine has many tools, instruments, technologies, measures, tests, and methods. But the most basic of all of these is language. For anything to happen between caregiver and patient, anything at all, there must be communication, each speaking to the other. And more than that, because doctor and patient often start from such different places of speaking, healing is an act, or multiple acts of translation. This healing language of which I speak is, of course, very much in tension with the medical language that doctors and many other healthcare professionals become fluent in the course of their training. The language of medicine, paradoxically, keeps the patient at a distance. Medical jargon explicitly is in Latin, deliberately esoteric. Most patients never learn to speak this language of medicine, and typically find it very removed from their own experience, sometimes traumatically so. In The Year of Magical Thinking, her powerful account of her experiences of shock and grief of the loss of her husband and simultaneous life-threatening illness of her daughter, Joan Didion evokes the traumatic effect of reading the report of her daughter's CT scan following neurosurgery simply by transcribing it, juxtaposed against the other details of the daily life of the family member of a sick person, and the efforts they make to understand what is happening to their loved one, which remains stranded and unaided by the language of medicine so important to treating the symptoms of the illness. She writes, I look at a printout of that day's CT report from UCLA and still go faint. The scan shows right hemispheric subdural hematoma with evidence of acute bleeding. Active bleeding cannot be excluded. The hematoma causes marked mass effect upon the right cerebrum, subfascial and early uncal herniation, with 19 millimeters of midline shift from right to left at the level of the third ventricle. The right lateral ventricle shows early entrapment. There is moderate to marked midbrain compression, and the perimesencephalic cistern is effaced. I think posterior falcine and left tendral subdural hematomas are noted. A small parenchymal bleed, likely contusional, is noted in the right inferolateral frontal lobe. The cerebellar tonsils are at the level of the foramen magnum. There is no skull fracture. There is a large right parietal scalp hematoma. March 25th, 2004, 10 minutes past 7 in the evening in New York. She had come back from the place where doctors say, we still don't know which way this is going, and now she was there again. For all I know, it had already gone the wrong way. We learn to speak of the patient's body as an object to be known and dissected and disciplined and fought, not as of them, belonging to them. There are reasons for this. Latin offers a rigorous framework for classification that the English language, for one, does not lend itself so easily to. Moreover, Latin has become the lingua franca of medicine the world over, enabling the benefits of Western medicine to span the globe. The language of medicine allows the symptoms of individual sufferers of angina, fibrillations, occlusions, the world over to have their symptoms decoded and translated into diagnoses that would name their affliction, whether it struck in Laos or Lithuania or Louisiana. But as comforting as it can be to feel that our illnesses are have comprehensible, treatable, even mechanical causes, to have our individual suffering knowable and classifiable in this way can evoke for the sufferer, as the medical sociologist Arthur Frank argues in The Wounded Storyteller, a duality of sensibility, a conflicted experience of the body as simultaneously an object to be known and the subjectively felt collection of sensations which we alone experience as ourselves. How to bridge this duality, this chasm between the body as scientific object and the body which contains ourselves and everything we uniquely are? One answer lies in this concept of upaya. We note that the means by which the authors of the Lotus Sutra chose to communicate the Buddha's teachings, including the notion of upaya itself, is through parables, through stories. This communicative choice, too, is upaya, for stories are the basic currency of skillful means. This is so because stories told in language are how we relate to each other, and relationship is fundamental to everything that is human and the bedrock of care and healing. Stories are not the only way to communicate, but they are perhaps the most essential form of communication. In narrative medicine, we ask clinicians to reflect on how they relate to their patients by sustained reflective reading and writing, and witnessing of one another's experiences. We have learned that stories, too, are upayas, and are alert to stories that help to understand different essential aspects of the caregiving relationship. Here are some of the lessons I have learned from the stories I have encountered through that work. From Mary Shelley's Frankenstein, subtitled A Modern Prometheus, I learn about Frankenstein's broken promise to his creation, his patient, and about the dangerous limits of scientific ambition. Victor Frankenstein is a doctor who wishes to harness medical technology to become a god by creating and gaining power over life and death. But when the creature proves monstrous to him, by not being human enough, he abandons his creation. Trouble ensues. But it ensues, eventually consuming all of Frankenstein's loving human relations, because the doctor has failed in his duty to his patient. That duty? Above all, the creature requires what is most basically human from his creator. He needs to be known, heard, and related to. Above all, Frankenstein has not met his duty to his creation, to care for him, to know and hear him. Frankenstein renders the doctor-patient relationship in starkest terms, as one human bound to another. From the terrible story of Dax Cowart, whose burns left him fatherless, blind and fingerless, disfigured and disabled in the eyes of the world and in pain beyond limit for months on end, in the throes of which he insisted on the right to end his life rather than face the agonies of rehabilitation, I've learned that it's not always easy to know who knows what is best for a patient's well-being, who has right to decide when treatment must proceed and when abandoned, and who has the right to decide one's fate. From The Spirit Catches You and You Fall Down by Anne Fadiman, I learned about the profound differences in how illnesses are experienced among different cultures. For the Hmong people, recently relocated from Laos to Merced, California, in the wake of America's disastrous adventure in Vietnam, their daughter's epilepsy was as much a blessing of the spirit world as a medical challenge. And the Western treatments offered and ultimately mandated were an insult and derangement of their way of living, which had already been so profoundly disordered by their displacement from their ancestral homes. The profound misapprehension between her family and their would-be caregivers ultimately contributed more to her death than to her healing. From Lucy Greeley's Diary of a Face, I understand that illness is much more than the treatment of the diseased body itself. That illness can transform a person's experience of themselves or her entire relationship to the world and of other people. From Margaret Etson's play Wit, I encounter the conflict at times irreducible between medicine as science and medicine as care. How in pursuit of a war against cancer, the treatment can injure the patient just as brutally as the illness, and that a doctor must never forget his duty is to her patient and not to science. I learn also again, in the imperious figure of the heroine, the dour English scholar Vivian Baring, the importance of care and healing, and also of being listened to and heard. Dr. Baring, who has lived her life keeping the messiness of life and its attendant feelings at bay through her superior intellect, comes face to face in the suffering of her last illness with her need for sympathetic connection, which she ultimately finds not in dry intellectual exchanges with the doctors who preside over her case, the same imperiousness with which she governed her classes in metaphysical poetry, but in the popsicle-giving ministries of the stupid nurse Sue, who all too well understands the quality of care Vivian requires in her final hours. From the poet and activist Audre Lorde's cancer journals, I understand that one's experience of illness is a refraction of one's identity, and that breast cancer, for example, doesn't mean the same thing for a white woman as a black woman, or the same for a straight woman as for a lesbian, or even the same for one lesbian of color as for another. And that in the old phrase, the personal is political. That is, that our ability to live as ourselves is constantly encroached upon by the normalizing pressures of society, perhaps nowhere more so than in the ostensibly objectifying halls of the hospital, and the clinic, and the consulting room. Again, from Joan Didion's The Year of Magical Thinking, I have learned not for the first time, that the mind has cliffs of fall, especially with respect to the processes of grief and mourning, and that the experience of the illness or loss of another can itself be an illness, an experience that affects the mourner physiologically, psychologically, socially, and in ways that this society remains wholly unprepared and terrified to contemplate. Every patient and every caregiver has a story to tell. And in taking in stories of other experiences of illness and caregiving, in setting them alongside our own, we create opportunities for our own experiences to be catalyzed, stirred and reorganized into something new. Most importantly, they help us see what we ourselves cannot. Through the common language of stories, they can help us to find the gaps in our own ways of knowing and practicing healing. And just as importantly, they can allow us to reflect on our own experiences as stories themselves. Just as stories of illness and care can teach us new ways to understand our work, so do our patients if we let them. Patients communicate to us in a myriad of ways and require us to be many different things in order to be the one that helps them. The first of these things that we must be is an open and adaptive listener. One of the obvious, though less heralded ways in which psychoanalysis originally distinguished itself as a means of healing was in the way it invited the patient to speak frankly and freely of whatever was on her mind, rooted in the belief that it was indeed conflicting or painful thoughts which were forbidden expression in polite society that were at the root of psychological suffering. To speak one's mind freely requires an enormous amount of trust in the doctor or caregiver. And while trust comes to some patients instinctively, or at least a degree of compliance to authority comes easily enough, to others it can be the most difficult thing in the world to achieve. Such, for example, is the case in the treatment of juvenile delinquents, whose antagonism to authority is well known, typically rooted in ruptures of trust in their earliest bonds. To connect with such a patient requires skillful means. August Eichhorn, an early Viennese analyst of adolescence, known for his creativity with patients, would connect with a delinquent brought to his care, say for having stolen a car, in this way. Well, you're here for stealing cars, but you got caught. So maybe your method of stealing is not so effective. Here, let me show you a better way to steal cars, so that next time you might not get caught. And thus began their treatment, with a connection. In my own practice, I find myself speaking many tongues and wearing many hats with my patients, even as the room and the frame we share remains unchanging, constant, and dependable. With each of them, we find a private language in which to learn about their inner world. One patient refers to the anxieties that cripple her as monsters, because to connect the actual monsters from her past with the feelings in the present that they animate is both too overwhelming and insufficient. Another patient rebels at the strictures of treatment. He wants to know if he can sit upside down, or on the floor, or even if we can conduct treatment outside. Understanding how important to him it is that he not feel controlled, I welcome these proposals, though regretting we cannot conduct treatment outside on the grounds there would be no privacy. The patient relaxes, though does not soon give up his wish to conduct our treatment on the move. As it goes, many years into treatment, it happens that a plumbing emergency forces me suddenly to abandon my office for a temporary space right before his appointment. In result, we wind up having to walk together from my office to the temporary space I had obtained. As we near the new space, having walked most of the way in an awkward silence, he remarks to me that we've now finally had our walking analysis at last. This granting of his wish, as he experiences it, proves immensely beneficial to his work, to our work, prompting a visceral experience in him of being heeded, responded to, and understood. The child patient locks me in the closet, ties me up, shoots me, kills me, resurrects me over and over again. By being able to punish me according to his heart's desire, and then bring me back to life again, thus undoing his fearful aggression, he is able to work through the enormous rage that engulfs him in response to his own experiences of being punished, unseen, ignored, and replaced. Another patient, for many years, comes very late, typically leaving only 10 or 15 minutes to spare in the sessions. For a long time, she expects punishment from me and punishes herself when I fail to meet the demand. Here, too, we come to understand this lateness as an expression of how her needs for so long had not been met, how treatment would not come to her, just as care had not come to her in the dependable fashion she so needed as a child. Another patient routinely declares he has nothing to say of interest, and indeed claims he could feel no feelings at all. It emerges that not unlike the character of Spock in Star Trek, he has learned to think his feelings so thoroughly that he can no longer recognize feelings at all, which then make themselves felt as a relentless, anxious pressure to think, and also in mysterious pains throughout his body, and inordinate sensitivity to changes in the environment, his registration of the emotional weather of his inner world replaced by the actual weather that is no less in control than his feelings. Yet another, a child of immigrants, feels for a long time he does not know himself and cannot say what he wants or what would make him happy. He has come to treatment in despair of ever feeling good. We learn that he has become trapped between his cultures, and more particularly, between his own yearning to pursue happiness for himself and his feeling bound to live for others, for his parents, even for ancestors long dead whom he's never met, and yet from whom he cannot conceive himself separate. Every patient expresses their inner world with their own storehouse of images, memories, obsessions, anxieties. Nearly every patient at some point laments having already said this 1,000,000 times. Yet even while tracing and retracing the same recurring themes and preoccupations, even using the same words again and again, the private language of the patient accrues and changes over time in the course of therapy. In successful therapy, the result is more reflective and affective use of language, with a corresponding lack of distressed affect. That is, the memories, themes, and preoccupations remain constant, but the way the patient experiences them changes as the patient learns to tolerate and understand the bad feelings that haunt them. It is important to be able to say to another, "What happened to you? How are you holding up?" For a person to be able to articulate their needs and feelings and experiences and have them to be received by another is the most fundamental form of human connection. Again, the act of translation. Infants have their needs met, and as this happens, they learn about their needs, and also about safety and connection of the inner experience to the world. As you can see from these typical instances of analytic practice, patients, people, are communicating constantly, simultaneously on multiple channels. Waking oneself up to the multiple channels is a critical facet of our work as caregivers. Such is the unique translational communication, the upaya, that takes place in psychoanalytic therapy, where two minds are joined together in understanding one of them. In this configuration, for the duration of the session, the therapist suspends an element of self-interest in order to become, at least in part, a character or projection of the patient's mind, and devoted to the understanding of the importance of that role for the patient. This meeting of the patient on their own terms, to behave and communicate with them in the ways that their behavior presses us toward, is the beginning of the creation of what the British analyst Donald Winnicott called a holding environment. That is to say, a situation modeled on a mother's holding her baby, in which the patient feels safe, attended, and responded to. A holding environment is yet another kind of upaya. And as analysts have learned from the failed or constricted results of more prescriptive treatments, this capacity to adapt to your patient and not force her to adapt to you is critical to a living, dynamic treatment. All caregiving relationships can ultimately be likened to the mother-infant bond. Mother, or whoever serves as an infant's first and primary caregiver, is the infant's first translator of the world, as well as translator of himself, his own body, his internal sensations, stimuli, want, and needs, to his own emerging understanding, on the road to its gradual and increasing ability to feel and speak for himself. As normal a part of human existence as this interface between mother and infant is, it is also an exceedingly delicate, even impossible balancing act, with risks on many sides. The principal dangers of this act of maternal translation are, on the one hand, anxious alienation through distance and estrangement, if the caregiver is not able to be fully attuned to her child's communications, or on the other, inhibition of a child's growing sense of independence and safety and comfort, should a mother be too anxious or overactive in attending to her child. Mother must come to know what's best for her child, when it is hungry, when tired, when cold, what they want before they do. But you must also allow them to come to know their needs for themselves. Difficulties in either direction can impact how an infant experiences itself in the world, as secure and entitled to care, or inhibited and insecure, afraid to be known, overly dependent, or any of the many vicissitudes our development may bring. And so the caregiver must learn to become elastic, open and receptive, and adaptable to the patient's needs as they emerge in treatment. I believe this is where the phrase, good enough, comes from. Winnicott referred to good enough mothering as how to negotiate this impossible task. No one gets it right, but there's a way not to get it too badly wrong. The necessity of this engagement with the patient's needs was not always evident to psychoanalysts. In the post-war heyday of psychoanalysis in America, analysis was taught very prescriptively. The analyst was to practice neutrality, to serve for the patient as a mirror or a screen upon which to project the patient's feelings. The patient was expected to lie down, say whatever came to mind, and the analyst would interpret the patient's associations. Whatever feelings the patient had about the therapist were understood to be manifestations of transference, the productions of the patient's own psyche, and unconnected to any real relationship they might have shared. But from the start, many analysts chafed at this prescription. In the 1950s, though others had begun much earlier, analysts introduced such concepts as the parameter, in which the frame of treatment is shifted in some way to accommodate the patient's needs. The couch is dispensed with, or the treatment made more supportive, or the analyst is more forthcoming about his or her personality, even the words that are used in the style of communication. Such analysts recognize that different patients might require different approaches in order to be effective. They recognize that in order to be helpful, one must tailor one's methods to the patient's individual needs. In other words, they must use expedient means. Such examples of upaya are ubiquitous in psychotherapeutic treatment.